You know those pictures, right? World leaders shaking hands, flags in the background, the entire world watching. That's summit diplomacy. It's high stakes, high risk, face-to-face negotiation at the very top. But behind all the pomp and circumstance, there's a really deep paradox.
And this is the question that's going to drive our whole explainer today. These meetings, they're incredibly risky. They cost an absolute fortune, and honestly, they can end in total spectacular failure. So why on earth do presidents and prime ministers keep holding them? What is the irresistible pull of the summit?
Now, getting the big bosses together is not a new idea. I mean, we're talking rulers meeting face-to-face all the way back in the Bronze Age. The practice has definitely waxed and waned over the centuries. It had a big moment in the Middle Ages, then kind of fizzled out, and made a little comeback in the 19th century. But its modern form was really cemented by those super dramatic, airplane-fueled meetings between Chamberlain and Hitler back in 1938. And then, well, the nuclear age hit. Suddenly, summits weren't just an option, they were seen as essential. They were, as the saying went, too important to be left to the diplomats. And that brings us right to the first part of our paradox, the really powerful arguments against even having these things. Because those professional diplomats, they've been warning us about this for a very, very long time. Just listen to this warning from Philippe de Comines, a French diplomat writing way back around the year 1500. His advice? It was blunt. If you want to get along, keep your leaders far, far apart. And the craziest part is that his critique, written over 500 years ago, is still the basis for the case against summitry today.
So what are the actual problems? Well, according to the pros, the leaders themselves are often the biggest liability. They can be vain, obsessed with publicity, and totally ignorant of the nitty-gritty details. Plus, they're usually jet-lagged and exhausted. They can get swayed by whether they personally like or dislike the person across the table, and they might just dismiss expert advice from the people who've spent their entire lives on these issues.
And okay, even if you have the perfect leader, the structure of a summit itself is just tricky. First, you've got the deadlock problem. A leader is the end of the line. They can't say, let me go check with my boss. So they either have to just walk away, which looks bad, or make a dumb concession just so they can claim they got a win. Then there's the personalization problem. Any deal is tied directly to them. So when they leave office, the deal often falls apart. And oh boy, history is just littered with these kinds of mishaps. Here's a classic. The Shah of Iran tells President Carter he thinks the Organization of African Unity is impotent, as in powerless. But President Carter, with his southern accent, hears the word important and enthusiastically agrees with him. It's a tiny little misunderstanding that could have had massive consequences. All right, so if these things are so risky and prone to failure, let's get back to our main question. Why do we keep doing them? Let's flip to the other side of this paradox and look at what makes these summits so, well, irresistible. Okay, here's the number one reason. Summits are absolutely incredible political theater. They are just unmatched when it comes to symbolism and propaganda. This was a lesson perfected during the Cold War, where a single handshake between two opposing leaders could send a powerful message of peace to the entire planet. And the best example of this, you have to look at President Nixon's visit to China in 1972. It was a genuine geopolitical earthquake, totally changing the Cold War landscape. But, and this is crucial, it was also an election year back in the US. Those TV images of Nixon meeting Chairman Mao, pure political gold.
But it's not just about the photo ops. There are some real upsides. For the folks back home, seeing their leader on the world stage proves they have international standing. It almost always gives them a nice little boost in the polls, and from a diplomatic standpoint, it's a chance to build something experts call bonded trust. The most famous example of this has to be the personal chemistry between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. A lot of people credit that relationship with helping to end the Cold War.
So now that we have a better idea of why summits happen, let's dig into how they actually work. Because it turns out not all summits are the same. They come in different flavors, each one designed for a specific job. You can basically break them down into three main types. First, you have your serial summits, like the G7 meetings. These are the regular, scheduled get-togethers, and they're best for serious, detailed negotiations. Then you've got the big, splashy, one-off ad hoc summits. These are the high-publicity events designed to grab headlines and force a deadline. And finally, there's the high-level exchange. This one is a bit more low-key, often just part of a bigger foreign tour. It's perfect for shoring up friendships and signing a few trade deals. And then there's this really fascinating special case, the funeral summit. When a major world leader passes away, all the other leaders gather. Now, you're not going to see any major deals get signed there, but that somber atmosphere is actually the perfect cover for quiet little chats, some behind-the-scenes signaling, and gathering intel, all away from the usual media circus. So, with all these different formats and all the huge risks involved, how in the world do you make a summit actually succeed? Well, the secret isn't what happens when the leaders are in the room. No, the secret is all in the preparation.
A successful summit really comes down to four key things. First, months and months of meticulous planning by senior officials who have the cool nickname Sherpas. Second, the final agreement is almost always pre-cooked. It's basically all negotiated before the leaders even get on their planes. Third, every single moment is choreographed. Every motorcade, every handshake, every press conference is scripted. And fourth, the officials manage expectations. They'll often downplay the chances of a big breakthrough so it doesn't look like a failure if one doesn't happen. But even with all that perfect planning, things can still go sideways. A leader can get sick, like Churchill did at a crucial summit in Bermuda. A totally separate world crisis can erupt and derail the whole thing, like the U-2 spy plane incident did. Sometimes huge protests can completely overwhelm the venue. Or, sometimes the leaders just don't vibe, which was famously the case with Obama and Putin. You can minimize the risks, but you can never, ever get rid of them completely. Which brings us to our final question for you. We live in an age of Zoom calls and secure phone lines, instant digital communication. In a world like this, is the whole act of flying leaders across the planet to meet in person just a dangerous, old-fashioned relic? Or, when we're facing such complex global problems, is that real, human, face-to-face contact, with all of its risks and all of its rewards, actually more essential than it's ever been?